service has failed me, unfortunately. So thank you for attending this afternoon's webinar. I'm going to be drawing upon some of my own PhD research and wider commentary as well, discussing the developments, the implementation and the effectiveness of the Rooney Rule within English cricket. So just to establish the broader context across a number of sports in the global north, despite the increase in ethnic and cultural diversity of players in grassroots and professional context, particularly excuse me, as well within English cricket, there remains a notable underrepresentation of racialised minority groups within sports coaching contexts. Now, in terms of racialised minority groups, just an important point around terminology. In this presentation, there are other uses of terminology, BAME, ethnically diverse. However, I'll be using racialised minority groups in this presentation to refer to first, second and third generation Black African, Black Caribbean, South Asian, East Asian and mixed ethnicity, those who share a numerical minority within the British population. However, despite these patterns of underrepresentation, a number of governing bodies, including the ECB, have undertaken in some aspects what we may describe as a racial awakening and an increased awareness of underrepresentation and related inequities for racialised minority coaches, engineered in part by a series of pressures. Firstly, political and legal pressures, such as the revised Code for Sports Governance, which mandates that public sport governing bodies such as the ECB are required to develop diversity and inclusion action plans in which they undertake an evidence work to address inequalities of this kind for underrepresented groups and racialised minority groups as well more broadly. In addition, specifically in cricket with the ICEC report, which, as we all know, noted countless experiences of discrimination along racialised, gendered and class lines, as well specifically in sports coaching context in cricket to the early day parliamentary notion in 2021, which called for the ECB to implement measures to address the underrepresentation of, particularly at that point, Black and South Asian coaches within cricket. In addition, partly this awareness has been underscored by social and moral pressures engineered by wider social justice movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as external athlete activists such as the testimony of Azim Rafiq, which plays greater snapshot on inequalities, not just within sports and sports coaching, but within cricket more broadly. So, in response to these pressures, the ECP has developed a number of policy dictates and actions in the form of the Ethnically Diverse Communities Plan, the EDI Action Plan, which both illustrate targets and statements to address such patterns of underrepresentation and inequalities for racialised minority coaches. In some aspects, a lot of these statements have been operationalised in the form of positive action measures and interventions to address inequalities of this kind. Now, positive action measures are legally permissible as a form of self-regulation in the Equality Act, which allows public and private bodies to undertake proportionate measures to alleviate present or historical disadvantage for underrepresented groups, including racialised minority groups. And generally speaking, particularly within sports coaching contexts, they've been broken down into softer and harder variants. In the first instance, softer variants focus targeted measures and support on an individual level to upskill racialised minority coaches, to enhance their technical and vocational skill sets and competencies, and to alleviate past barriers and disadvantages. Softer variants of this kind have mainly taken the form in sports coaching contexts of targeted financial or bursary support to enable underrepresented and minoritised coaches to access and obtain high-level coach education qualifications, which are a prerequisite for employment in elite coaching positions. In addition, these have taken the form of mentor and placement opportunities, both of which variants of this kind are present currently within the ECB, through the National Coach Bursary Scheme, which provides targeted support for underrepresented groups to obtain levels 1 to 4, as well as mentor and placement opportunities, as stated, mainly in the South Asian Action Plan within first-class counties. In addition, in recent years, a number of governing bodies, including the ECB, a number of scholars, have alluded that whilst individualised support of this kind has shown some success in increasing the competencies, particularly the social, technical and vocational competencies of racialised minority coaches, they're in fact conceptually limited in scope and do very little to disrupt the organisational and institutionalised processes that maintain patterns of underrepresentation and inequality within sports coaching domains. And in recent years, scholarly focus has called for the introduction of targeted harder variants, which provides interventions that disrupt and reform these patterns of racialised closure within patterns of practices of coach recruitment that have both engendered, perpetuated and enabled disadvantage and exclusion over time. And the most wide-ranging mechanism or intervention has been the Rooney Rule across a number of sports coaching contexts. Oh, is that not working? I just now think it's useful to, I think it'd be a useful exercise to discuss the historical context of the development and the introduction of the Rooney Rule within practice. Now, the rule itself was developed and implemented by the National Football League in 2003 in response to notable representational disparities between the playing and coaching tiers of the sport, where, and this is most illustrated where, in comparison between both tiers, where the playing population was estimated to be over 75% from people of colour or racialised minority groups, people of colour to use their terminology in North American context, where less than 10% of coaches were from a racialised minoritized background. The rule itself was introduced as a result of pressure from two civil rights lawyers, which felt there was evidenced examples of the National Football League and as well as their franchises deliberately breaking Title 11 and various civil rights laws. Therefore, the rule was introduced in 2003 as a result of this pressure. And although it initially stipulated that one suitably qualified coach from a population of colour or a qualified racialised minority coach be interviewed for emergent coaching positions, this has since been expanded to two, as well as for all front of house positions that they conceptualise to include positions such as directors of football, athletic directors, etc. Now, the rule itself is independently monitored with penalties and financial sanctions for non-compliance, and there's been notable examples, unfortunately, over the years where this has taken place. Now, although the rule itself has been cited as a key mechanism to not just formalise coach recruitment practices, but also as a key mechanism for which the representation of coaches, as in head coaches in particular, has increased over time, from 2 in 2003 to 9 in 2004. Now, the Rooney Rule has been cited as the gold standard for modifications to coach recruitment practices in the form of harder variants of positive action or affirmative action in US contexts, as a response to disrupting these, as commonly cited, and within my own research as well, these informal network-based and headhunting approaches, which are often unchecked, unregulated, and unchallenged, where particularly key white stakeholders are point from their dominant social and their known social and cultural networks, which serve to discriminate against racialised minority coaches. Now, there's been notable examples of variations of the rule's introduction across a number of sporting contexts, particularly in UK sport within English football, within the voluntary and mandatory codes of coach recruitment, and also within English cricket. So the rule was first developed in 2018 and stipulated, like its American counterpart, the one suitably qualified racialised minority coach would be assured an interview guarantee for emergent coaching positions with men's, women's and disability national team squads. Furthermore, there's a recommendation that similar processes of inclusive shortlisting should be adopted with respect to senior level coach recruitment within coach recruitment practices within first class counties and county boards. However, despite sharing similar intentions and emphasis to its North American counterpart, there are a number of differences and clauses which arguably serve to restrict and dampen the rule's effectiveness in addressing racialised inequalities, particularly within coach recruitment practices within English cricket. In the first instance, there is a lack of regulatory oversight from the ECB, legislating the rule's introduction within first-class counties, similarly recommending the rule's adoption as opposed to regulatory oversight. This is compounded by a lack of sanctions for non-compliance for first-class counties. Therefore, the adoption of the rule is dependent solely on the attitudinal buy-in and the operational commitment of key stakeholders within first-class counties, in which coaches from my own research and prior scholarly analysis in sports coaching context more broadly has illustrated that key stakeholders, particularly within English cricket, conceptualise the coach recruitment landscape as inherently fair, unbiased, and meritocratic, representing an egalitarian space. Now, these ideologies denying the existence of racialised barriers to obtaining coaching employment for minoritised coaches provide resistance to the introduction of measures of this kind. And this is further evidenced in the lack of uptake across first-class counties more broadly, where at the time of delivering this presentation, only one has introduced the rule within their coach recruitment practices. In addition, this is compounded by operational resistance from the ECB itself, where there's notable examples of the rules being bypassed, which a number of interviews in my own research felt weaken their base of legislative and recommendations and enforcement for wider adoption of the rule. So, just to conclude, although the adoption of the Rooney Rule within English cricket in many respects may be described as a proactive measure to address racialised inequalities within coach recruitment practices, in one respect, this goes above and beyond their legislative compliance, particularly in relation to sports governing their compliance with sports equality legislation more broadly. However, the rule itself is and its impact is notably weakened and dampened by a series of opt-out clauses for first-class counties. So the rule may best be described as gestural and in some respects a form of window dressing. In future, it's recommended that the ECB adopt similar processes to its North American counterpart in providing regulatory oversight for the rule's adoption within coach recruitment practices within first-class counties, as well as financial sanctions or sanction more broadly for non-compliance. It's argued here that the introduction of measures of this kind would provide the rule and the legislative scope to be able to instill both transformational and long-lasting change to address inequalities of this kind within English cricket. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. I may have gone slightly over there, Philippa. I apologise for that.
No,